climate change litigation in India. How is climate change litigation connecting? Direct reference to climate change litigation in India has been forthcoming only now. Although Indian judiciary has been more active in playing the role compared to our executive or legislature, because environment is a shared territory in a concurrent way. It has got its obligations emanating from Ministry of Environment and Forestry for very long, as it was called, and then environment seen majorly, as I told you, as a source of resources, rather than environment being seen as an integral part with the plethora of rights. So it was only after the new government took over in 2014, they added this idea of climate change. So climate change, now the ministry has got this also in its suffix, in its name. But the exclusive ministry for climate change came up only in Gujarat. Gujarat was the only state to have an exclusive ministry for climate change. So such is the checkered history of India's executive commitment or legislative commitment as far as climate change is concerned. But on the other hand, India's state obligations are also very well articulated now with India's leadership. I have a lot of data on that which must have been discussed earlier, but mainly the data is talking about among G20 how India is faring very well. India is on the top in terms of three important parameters: the mitigation strategies such as reduction in fossil fuel usage, in terms of policy development in the second area, and also in terms of funding. So compliance with the Paris Convention and its subsequent conference of parties as far as India is concerned seems to be on the priority level, and you are seeing now how electrical mobility is being incentivized and encouraged. So Indian state has been quite active in last 2-3 years, much more than earlier. So in a way, India may be faster and closer to fulfilling the obligation of emission reduction at this rate, the way the metros are coming up everywhere. More so because India's pollution levels are really worrisome. But then on the one hand, in modernizing and in approaching, India's primary target has been urban spaces. Of course, large percentage of people live in urban centers. Large percentage of money also comes there. Huge industrial activity happens there. But on the other hand, what Delhi is experiencing is because of the traditional farming practices. So agricultural, simultaneously tackling all the evildoers in terms of emission has not been possible for India. India has got about 70% of the population which is agriculture dependent, and it's not a modernized agriculture. So, and then India's usage of fossil fuel in domestic spaces, replacement of the fossil fuel partially or fully with solar energy and other dimensions is also an issue. Induction, for example, these have not been quite faster. So we have been focusing more and more on vehicular mobility and more and more on the Amrita Bindu concept of fulfilling the obligation in those areas. So individual states also need to act. Simply central government's international commitment is not going to ensure everything, because it's a concurrent list where both the state and the center have got a role to play. For example, forests are central government, but on ground forest administration has to have the support from the police and law and order, which is coming from the state government. So this situation could be more efficient. Another interesting development in India as far as climate change litigation or climate related litigation, which earlier in the static concept of environmental law was related to, is from this great experiment of public interest litigation, which allows those without locus standi to take over an issue of public interest and seek the remedy. So environmental cases, the series of MC Mehta cases and other cases have been coming up on the basis of the fundamental rights enshrined within the constitution, which neatly align with the human rights grounds. Much more in this area could be told, but to be very precise, polluter pays principle came in part of that. then the public trust doctrine, that environment is to be administered as a public trust by the government, I mean in extension of the public trust principle by the government, and right to free, prior and informed consent in terms of acquisition of lands and other areas, especially with the mega projects, So this is how development environment concerns in terms of protection of biodiversity, intervention in the life spaces of the tribals for this was enunciated. Now, one word on polluter pays principle. Polluter pays principle has a very strong economic dimension, which formed the foundation of the whole idea of carbon credits and carbon trading. Polluter pays principle is supposed to be the most effective part of the various principles governing climate change or environmental policy and law. Why is polluter pays principle effective? Because it has an economic dimension. It exacts a price. It levies a penalty. It in a way circumscribes the profit-seeking motive of big operations or big manufacturing and big industries. So polluter pays principle has been the effective one, but lofty one, as we discussed in the earlier classes, have come from intergenerational equity and public trust doctrine. Lofty in the sense the ideal and value-based one. So on polluter pays principle, plenty of literature has been there, plenty of policy has been developed at the national and international level, especially in relation to sustainable development goals. So some of you can think of your assignments theoretically, drawing parallels between countries on best practices on these dimensions. Now, as far as judiciary in India is concerned, we have two levels. One is the National Green Tribunal, which is the evolution in the post-2010 era. Prior to that, we had the High Court and the Supreme Court, which have entertained these cases. And judiciary's activity has been qualified as selectively progressive and overreaching. It has affected the working of the regulatory bodies. It has shaped governmental regulatory structures for the environment. However, one classic comment that is made by the scholars is that India's climate change litigation is still in the baby stages. It is still in the nascent stages because directly addressing climate change has not happened. Indirectly, it has been addressed. So, because for very long we are obsessed with the idea of, or not obsessed, we have been more and more strengthening and we are familiar with the idea of environment rather than climate change. So we were used to that set of vocabulary and we were used to approaching it from that point of view as resource. Environment is predominantly a static, stand-alone, as it is, positive kind of aspect. Climate change is a dynamic aspect. So climate change is in relation to the active part of the environment resulting in disproportionate consequence, and climate change per se is shifts in the weather patterns and resulting in extreme weathers and causing devastation. So the two correlations are not yet very clear in Indian litigation space. For example, I was studying the issue of mangrove plantation to be removed. Justice Oak was in Bombay High Court then. So there also, the idea was if you fell the trees, replace those trees. The specific nature of mangroves as carbon sinks was something as that's what we said, scientific dimension coming into the judicial discourse was not yet ripe there. Similarly, when it was challenged in case of Sundarbans, the construction industry interfering and constructing new buildings and in such sensitive zone, and these new buildings construction showing off the tigers, the Bengal tigers, or them throwing so many kind of pollutants into the sea or the water space. I mean, there is also backwaters there. That dimension was discussed in a very standard environmental litigation dimension, but the larger dimension of climate change has not come into the discourses of the petition or to the judgment. So even though public interest litigation is innovative and it has given the space for all the environmental lawyers, local communities and advocates, even in case of enviro-legal cases, which is about the Dongri tribes and their deprivation in case of Vedanta's interference in bauxite mining in Nyamgiri Hills. It is more about developmental projects adversely impacting, causing this litigation. But larger impact of climate change mitigation and adaptation has not come to the core of the litigation in India. So in India, this kind of progressive environmental jurisprudence and protection of the rights of different stakeholders, especially the communities on land, on forest, especially in forest dwelling and all, and their democratic decision making as far as intervention in these lands is concerned, this has been very strongly coming forth, which is a good point. And then in 2010, we had National Green Tribunal. What is so special about Green Tribunal? In a way, environmental litigation was outsourced to the Green Tribunal, and it was dealt in its validation, in its valid place of honor, because it had multidisciplinary expertise within the tribunal, and it was a tribunal, not a court. So it was more by deliberation. Tribunal always has this arbitrative approach, which means that all discuss, the scientists discuss, there is a scientist there is an engineer or planner there, and the judge is heading all of that. So specialized, dedicated avenue for environmental disputes began with that, and many progressive judgments came. So some of the judgments I'm going to capture. One of the major judgments that has come till 2019 is Ridhima Pandey versus Union of India. We have many other judgments. Ridhima Pandey is a little girl, 9-year-old girl from Uttarakhand region. She was the plaintiff in this case. In 2017, she files the case in National Green Tribunal of India, and she argues that public trust doctrine, which is states' commitment under Paris Agreement. She relates public trust doctrine for the first time to India's commitment to Paris, means states' obligation under Paris Agreement, and states' obligation as far as existing environmental law and climate change related policy expect the state to take greater action to mitigate the adverse impacts of climate change. So it said, instead of pitching environment versus climate, it said that environment encompasses or includes the idea of climate, therefore climate change. So the case was authorizing the National Green Tribunal to address this substantial question relating to the environment. So substantial question relating to the environment was perceived in a static way, as I told you, with all the stories. So for the first time, climate and climate related aspects, and including the adequacy of India's climate change mitigation effort, and its correlation with the public trust doctrine and states related obligation and other legal obligations, was the core of this case. So when we discuss the global parameters of or impact factors or motivating factors for climate change litigation, here it is very interesting. So she and the future generation children had the right to healthy environment. So intergenerational equity comes in here in her argument, that climate change affects children disproportionately. We have a whole lot of argument on children and climate change. Children are vulnerable to the impact of heat wave, displacement, diseases, and malnutrition. So see the discourse here. So the case itself captures all these climate change related human rights impact, especially on the vulnerable group of children. Diseases, for example, Delhi, children brought up in Delhi, many of them face that breathing disorder in this particular season around Diwali, which coincides with the stub burning season. Diseases are also very common in areas which have high rate of pollution. Where was I reading? Bombay, for example. Now Bombay has a very high pollution index, among others. Uttar Pradesh as well, the Yamuna belt seems to have large number of tanneries, although these tanneries were closed pursuant to MC Mehta case. So here children suffer more than the adults because their immunity is still beginning to emerge. So in 2019, the National Grain Tribunal dismissed the case, saying that climate change is covered in the process of impact assessment under the Environment Protection Act. There is no reason to presume that all these international agreements are not reflected in the policies of the government, etc. Now, if you look at that, judiciary is at the forefront, but then it doesn't mean that Indian people do not have a right against the negative effects of climate change. So where do we see that? First time it was, although litigant argued there, the argument was not appreciated. Then in High Court of Rajasthan, where Rajasthan took suo motu cognizance, it passed legislation connecting climate change, food adulteration, poverty and welfareism in relation to heat waves. So we saw how the judiciary was balancing equally crucial goals of holistic approach that does not disparage one concern from the other. Connecting of nutrition, food adulteration, poverty and welfareism to climate change was a very important dimension. So National Green Tribunal Act, which saw the establishment of the National Green Tribunals, they could connect to these cases as I told you earlier. Now I bring you to the latest case. Ranjit Singh versus Union of India. MK Ranjit Singh versus Union of India, as I told you, the Great Indian Bustard. The MK Ranjit Singh is a conservationist. So they were looking at impact of mega projects of the government, the infrastructure projects, on endangered species like this bird. This bird was once named as the national bird, but because of its name sounding very derogatory sometimes, Great Indian Bustard, they did not want to identify it as the national bird. So the peacock won the race in being the national bird. But Great Indian Bustard and Lesser Florican, these are the two birds which are identified to be endangered species because their numbers are decreasing. So in this case, there are two series of Ranjit Singh case. One was long ago, where all the conservation dimensions of Great Indian Bustard was highlighted. But the latest case which he opened was in terms of major projects also supported by private funding for solar lines. So the conflict between development projects, especially overhead power transmission lines, and the wildlife conservation is the one which raised that conflict, that on the face of the climate change, isn't government responsible to protect biodiversity like the Great Indian Bustard? Let's study about this Great Indian Bustard. Somehow this seems to be haunting me in the law school because in 2017, one of my old students, by 9, he was doing his PhD on sugar, Shetkari farmers, and he brought this issue saying that lot of land in Maharashtra also is not touched by anybody because it is considered as the habitation of Great Indian Bustard. On the one hand, many farmers are willing to till these lands, and on the other hand, government has identified it as protected zone. Although he says that right from his grandfather's time, nobody has seen this bird. So he says this mythical bird seems to be coming in the way of right to livelihood of many farmers, he said. And he said it is time for us to take a call and ask for a public interest litigation to free those zones which are considered as birds' habitat. This is what he said, that this is mystery and this is a mythical story about the bird and it is not real, was his argument. So we didn't get enough evidence. We didn't want to encourage him in the public interest litigation. But I'll be showing you a lot of interesting facts. So this bird is native to southern and western India, it is said. Maharashtra is also supposedly native to it, but according to our Zamdar, Rahul Zamdar's argument, nobody has seen that bird any time. So it typically occupies grasslands or arid regions. So you can imagine the desert connected areas in Rajasthan, then some parts of Gujarat. So, IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, it classified this bird as a critically endangered, not just endangered, critically endangered, because its population in the 2010 varied from 250 to about 50 mature birds. So there was a sudden decline in the number of these birds. Therefore, it urged conservation action to prevent the bird from being functionally extinct, completely extinct within a few decades. So 2010 to 2024, 75% reduction. So what are the mitigation measures? Because global warming is increasing, therefore the dwindling population of these species is happening. So the judgment emphasized the analyzing of factors. It said that it's not that global warming is not affecting any species. In this species, it is it is resulting in low fecundity, means low fertility, fragmentation of their habitat, because one bird is here and we don't know how many birds are there, and then out of loneliness and they don't have the gregarious possibility of birds groups to hang out, habitat loss, they may not find food because of that, predators also, and the loss of prey, they starve to death as well because their habitat is lost. And in environment, in biome, everything is interlinked. So the case is a writ petition which wanted to protect these two species, the lesser florican and the great Indian bow. Both are big birds and both are very much native to the arid lands and western India and to some extent to the central India. There was a long ago order given which said that all electrical transmission lines should be laid underground. And when they laid these lines underground, it proved inefficient and it became a safety hazard as well. Renewable energy implementation became difficult with the underground laying of the lines. Therefore, they were going for the aerial laying of the line, above overhead laying of the lines. Now, it is here that the conflict between or interplay between safeguarding biodiversity and the obligation of India under Paris Agreement for renewable energy implementation and sustainable development goals. So, if overhead power transmission lines became underground, then expert committee has to be seeing that what happened, what exactly has happened in the past approach and why the new approach, because there is this conflicting argument which is coming up now about the habitat of the great Indian bustard. So court reviewed these factors as observed in the petition. Bhargav, I'll come to you. And the actions taken by the government, specifically habitat improvement and conservation. Now, this is exactly what my student was also challenging. So much money is going there when there is not much bird. The court once again called upon the Union of India and many ministries. Chief Justice called Justice Chandrachud called many ministries, and he created the committee nominating officers from these concerned ministries, and what kind of measures are there they need to be implemented, and the impact has to be studied and reported to the court. If you look at the legal context, when you saw the facts now let's see the law. One is right to life. You know that no one shall be deprived of life and liberty unless according to law and according to the due process established by law. So the right to life has been an ever evolving right. 21 has stretched itself. I hope it doesn't become like a rubber band losing its tenacity, but right now it is essential that it has been stressed because it is the only right which cannot be touched during emergency as well. So once upon a time it was touched, but now we have safeguarded it in the 44th Amendment. So that is where we stand in terms of Article 21. What are the previous rulings? Supreme Court has already connected environmental protection to right to life in MC Mehta. And there has been a very strong basis laid out by this series of cases. And then Constitution also has got in its non-justiciable parts of Part 4 in Article 48A in states' duty to protect and 51AG citizens' duty to protect, which emphasize these duties under the Indian Constitution. Although they may not be directly actionable, they in a way support the whole scheme of protecting the environment. So the Supreme Court explicitly recognized the right to be free from adverse effect of climate change under Article 21 as an outcome of this judgment. It clearly articulated for the first time right to protect against climate change, or what is the word that it used? Right to be free from adverse impact or adverse effects of climate change as a fundamental right. So what are the interconnected rights? between climate change and other fundamental rights we already discussed, which again are within the Article 21 and also in Part 4, right to health, livelihood, clean water, sanitation. And the court said that climate change can adversely impact vulnerable communities and it can increase the existing inequality, exacerbating already existing inequality. Now, what is government's responsibility here? That is what the Supreme Court highlighted. It held that government is accountable for the effective measures to mitigate these impacts and protect fundamental rights. So, government has a duty to implement policies and also to increase the resilience to climate change and to increase adaptation measures and to see that there is a just transition to low carbon economy, the circular economy. And it is not just transition, but just transition, so that it is very well planned and it doesn't in the way leave anyone out of it, or it doesn't adversely or disproportionately negatively impact anyone. So the Supreme Court in a way captured all the facets of climate change related law and rights. If you look at the breakdown of the judgment, you can identify these in these subheadings. This is how I presented this in Palermo. This is how we identified. One is constitutional basis. I told you, Article 21 and also Article 14, the right to equality, so that vulnerable communities which are more affected are not left out. Right to, because equality is not just about being the same. It is also about the different. Those who are different being brought within the fold of treatment in terms of opportunities, access, and in terms of substantive and procedural equality. Then, right to a healthy environment. So the connection between healthy and clean environment and climate right are seen as essential to human well-being. It is mentioned there already. Then, balancing development and conservation. So, if you are developing renewable energy because of the obligations under the climate change law internationally, then you also, and which is low carbon economy, circular economy, renewable energy source related economy, or transition into that kind of energy sources, then climate change should not hinder progress but guide towards sustainable path. Now, which means that it is not just human being, but all the other obligations under environment related convention, of which biodiversity is one, where IUCN is reminding us of the biodiversity in the form of this Great Indian Bustard. Now, blanket ban. There is a blanket ban on any kind of initiative because Great Indian Bustard is there. Such blanket ban should be rejected. So Supreme Court brought that balance. It said that environment protection is crucial, but simply banning the whole development project is not the effective solution. If you look at activists, they will ask about blanket ban. But if you look at lawyers like us, we will always see the pro and con, because balance is always the classic nature of justice. We have to look at positives and negatives, short-term and long-term consequences, cost and benefit. So lawyers do a kind of a converging multifaceted analysis, because that is the lawyering technique, where we go by data, where we go by problems identification, and then we explore multiple solutions, and then we interlink these solutions to see how far the problem is completely wiped out or at least majorly dealt with. So this case, in that way, said that blanket ban on development project is not the solution, because we are not telling development now, we are telling sustainable development, which means we don't ban development, we try to regulate it and balance it by making it sustainable. So in the nuanced approach, both environment and developmental concerns are balanced, and it should be based on scientific evidence. So the court encouraged the use of scientific evidence and expert opinion to guide the decision making. So it did not give the conclusion. It said that right to climate change is a fundamental right, but then every case has to be dealt with this approach. See the last two lines, that balancing environment and development concerns, encouraging use of scientific evidence and expert opinion, so that decision making is guided.